Okay, in this lecture, we're going to go through some of the basics on conducting surveys and also critiquing survey items. Surveys are used quite a bit in assessment work, and oftentimes you'll see problematic aspects, certainly within surveys. A fundamental principle here is that it's much easier to critique survey items than it is to create survey items. So, first, one of the first things in conducting surveys that a lot of people don't think of is to actually have hypotheses. What is it that you want to determine? I get asked often to help people with their data analyses off of survey data that they have. And in working through them, I can tell if it's a long survey, they didn't really have their hypotheses set up ahead of time. And oftentimes, out of that as well, is that what they really wanted to ask in the survey never really pointedly got asked. They kind of asked a number of different things around what they really cared about, but they never really got to the target item. So taking time to determine what are your hypotheses is really important. If you don't do that, as you'll see here, you'll get overwhelmed with the data. So there'll be just tons of information there to sift through. And again, sometimes oftentimes you end up with data that don't even address the concerns that you actually have. And then you want to determine who it is that you ask. And we won't focus so much on this, but I'll just kind of go through this pretty quickly. So, you need to define your population. So for a lot of the assessment work I do here at Bethel, the population might be the graduating senior class, or other times it might be all of the college and arts and sciences students. So that potentially can be a population, or it can be a population of just for a particular department for a survey. And then you want to determine whether or not you want to use the whole population, you want to try to do a complete census, or if you're going to try to do a sample of that population. And I'll tell you, in the work that we do, we'll do a mix of these things. Oftentimes we do try to do a census. It's very difficult to get a total census. You're not going to get everybody's not going to participate in a particular survey, but oftentimes we want everyone to have an opportunity to be able to say what it is they want to say about the institution. So different types of samples. There's convenience samples. Those are of samples to where you'll see these oftentimes out on the web or in other places, like on TV, to where they ask you to go online and take their survey. It's simply the people who take the time to complete the survey. So it's complete convenience sample. And you can probably think of the number of problems that can take place with that. That people who only care deeply about a particular issue, if it's on tax cuts or something else, are the ones who are going to complete the survey. So there can be quite a bit of bias in those convenience samples. There's quota samples, which are basically convenience samples, but then they try to have quotas set up for a particular demographic. So let's say at Bethel, where at the undergraduate side, the split is about 62% female students and 38% male students, we might, if we're going to try to get 100 students to complete a survey, we might go until we get to 62 women and 38 men, if we think it's very important to have a balance that way in the surveys. The little thing to know about assessment in higher education and research in higher education in general is that it's far easier to get women to participate than it is to men. It's very difficult to get men to participate in surveys and in other types of assessment activities. There are various random samples. So a random sample is where everybody has an equal chance of being sampled and chosen to participate in the survey. So random samples, when you hear the phrase that it was a scientific poll or it was a scientific survey, that means that random sampling was used. Everybody has an equal chance of being selected to participate in the survey. Now, what can still be problematic about it is just because they were selected doesn't necessarily mean it is that they're going to complete the survey. And then stratified random samples are similar to kind of similar idea to adding quotas to it, is to make sure if there's a particular demographic that's very important. I'll use gender again as well. That we randomly select to where 62% we know are going to be women and 38% are going to be men off it. So the stratified random samples. And sometimes we'll do that in particular if if there's smaller populations that we're working from as well, we want to make sure that we're getting that we'll get an equal distribution. Sometimes random sampling doesn't do its complete job that way. And then make sure you define what it is that you want to measure, and that can be tricky as well. What is it that we really want to know? What are the questions that we really want to ask the individuals who are participating in the survey? There's format issues as well. Do you want to have quantitative responses, dichotomous type, true or false, yes or no types of responses, or polychotomous, where the classic of what you see is the Likert scale for that, the strongly disagree to strongly agree, and I'm certain you've seen those scales quite often. So Likert scales are what are used most often for this. And you'll notice when you get into Qualtrics is that Qualtrics actually has some things set up to where it'll give you some options of different scales. Actually, not just some, a lot of different options of different types of scales that could be used for your particular survey item. And then one other thing I like to add about this, and I see this mistake often, is that the demographic information will be front-loaded in a survey, and typically it's best actually to keep the demographic information towards the end of the survey. The reason why is because if you're answering all these demographic questions ahead of time, sometimes you don't know what the other questions are. You might be worried, why do I want to tell you what my race is, or why do I want to tell you what my gender is, or what department that I'm in, or those kinds of things, if they don't know what it is that they're responding to in the rest of the survey. But if you have it at the end of the survey, they already know what it is that they responded. There's less of this conspiracy kind of thinking that ends up taking place in the person who's responding to the survey item. So oftentimes they're more willing then to provide the demographic information. There are oftentimes you'll see open text responses in surveys, and I think that they can be quite helpful. In a number of the alumni surveys that we use, we do have open text boxes, and we do get really interesting information from those, and actually from our student surveys as well. So this can be very helpful in that way. You can get more nuanced responses and everything else. One of the problems is that they can be very time consuming to analyze, and oftentimes honestly, I see people will have these open text boxes, but they never actually really analyze the responses from these text boxes, and that's very problematic. So a dangerous thing, what I see oftentimes, is that people have these surveys with just tons of open text boxes. One, people hate taking surveys with lots of open text boxes. They hate responding to them, and so they're less likely to actually answer the questions then, if you have a number of them that are there. And two, it's going to give you so much data that oftentimes you really can't use all of it, because doing qualitative analyses is a lot of work. The quantitative analysis is easier to do. So some rules here for writing good questions. You'll see a lot of avoid in here for these rules. But some of the things, avoid leading questions, and you'll see these a lot in surveys that tend to be biased in some way. So the leading people on to say, don't you think that there should be gun restrictions or something like that? It leads the person on to a particular response. Avoid the double-barreled question. So basically, oftentimes when you see an "and" in there, that it's going to be a double-barreled question. It's basically asking two things at once. Do you think the institution should provide more services for students with disabilities and who have trouble in academic troubles in the classroom? And it's two questions that are being asked there. So it's best to actually just separate them both out. Avoid long questions, so try to keep the items no longer than 20 words. Actually, around 10 words ends up being ideal, so keeping it simple as possible, the items as simple as possible, is what's most important off of there. So to have that, that's one of the most important things if you're creating a survey. Keep the items as short as possible. Obviously, avoid double negatives and negations, or avoid overly sophisticated or technical types of terms. And oftentimes that's what's technical to somebody else might not seem like a technical or sophisticated term for you. So as you see at the bottom to where it says pre-test the items, that's what's most important, is to pre-test the items on the particular population that you're doing the survey for. And avoiding words and terms that can be misinterpreted easily. I believe that Pittsburgh should increase its Coke population. What do you mean by, or Coke production? Do you mean Coca-Cola? Do you mean cocaine? Do you mean Coke is what we normally think of for Pittsburgh? So avoid that misinterpretation part, and then mix your positively and negatively worded items. So don't always have them on a positive stream in terms of the items. To have what we call pro-trade items and con-trade items is best off of that, to keep it balanced, to make sure that you don't get some kind of response sets from the individual. And again, pre-test the items on the population that you're using it for is what's most important. So if you're using a survey for 10-year-olds, you need to pre-test the items on those 10-year-olds ahead of time to make sure that they're really understanding what it is that you're asking. And then the same thing with if it's a college student population, to make sure that they're understanding the items in the way in which they were intended. Writing good survey items certainly is harder than it looks. So an example from a professional polling company, as you know, the term Holocaust usually refers to the killing of millions of Jews in Nazi death camps during World War II. Does it seem possible, or does it seem impossible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? Wow, that's a mouthful, isn't it? This was an actual survey item, and it created an uproar because the response said, from this survey item, was that 1 in 5 Americans doubts that the Holocaust took place. Now, Gallup poll questioned the survey results, saw the item, and figured that the item was causing the problem, which it was, and they asked a much more specific question: do you doubt the Holocaust took place or not? Again, that fits more in the kind of the 10 words or less type of item. And then from that, they actually found that 9% had a doubt, which still seems quite high to us, but it's certainly much better than the 20%. So you see from this item, one, it's just too long, longer than 20 words, but you also have these double negatives in there. You also have the fact that using this statement about Nazi extermination, sometimes that can be confusing for people in terms of thinking that all Jews have been obliterated, but they have Jewish friends, so obviously extermination didn't take place. So there's a number of problems from this item, but remember, this is from a professional polling company. It's much more difficult to write items than you think. Here's some other examples. This is from a consulting firm from Washington, D.C., who created a set of items for a Minnesota State University, not Minnesota State Mankato. I'm just trying to say it was more trying not to identify the university where this had taken place. And you can see the items that are on here, the number of triple-barreled items that exist here. And so this was very problematic. I mean, what actually can they take from the survey? It's very difficult to know. On top of the fact that they also had some other problems in that a very limited number of students and faculty actually participated in the survey. So one of the last things I'll tell you here is that if you're creating a survey, look for pre-existing items. They typically have already been tested, and they'll tend to be well written, not always well written. And sometimes what they can do is allow you to get some comparative information, which can be very valuable for you as well.